All right, we are into Unit 2, and in Unit 2, we will focus completely on the Gospels. There are 4 Gospels. We will look at them as a group and then look at each Gospel separately as well. The first question that we should consider is, why 4 Gospels? When the Christians began to spread through the Roman Empire, they wrote accounts of the life of Jesus. Everybody who remembered something about Jesus wrote an account. So by the end of the first century, there were, believe it or not, about 30 different Gospels. And when the church decided it was time to sort of collect the books so we can create Christian scriptures, the big question was, with so many Gospels, what is the point? 30 different accounts of the life of Jesus, that will be too much. The volume would be too great. So they came up with the idea that we need to narrow it down, what we call today filtering. It's like going into Google, you're looking for a certain subject and you have hundreds of entries come in, but you choose the ones that you think are the most beneficial towards that topic. And so they ended up picking 4 Gospels. Now the reason for selecting 4 was a little strange. Somebody suggested, well, there are 4 corners to the earth, the 4 points on the compass, therefore we should have 4 Gospels. Somebody else suggested, well, there are 4 primary angels in heaven, so, let's keep according to that. We don't know if any of that is true. One man did suggest these 4, and we're not sure why he picked on these 4, but he said, why not just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? As it so happens, 3 of them were people who actually lived and worked with Jesus. 2 were disciples. One was, his mother was a disciple of Jesus, so he was very close. The other, Luke, had a different upbringing, but he was very close to Paul, and so still close to Jesus. In the end, we discover that some of the 30 Gospels are what we would call today spurious. They had strange ideas. But what we have here are 4 views. And the 4 Gospels tell us different details, different perspective, different angles into the life of Jesus. But it's basically the one story. So on the main points of that story, they are in agreement with each other. Now, I think that there are also 4 Gospels because of different audiences. Clearly, Matthew wrote for Jewish people. John wrote for a second-generation Christian. Luke was writing to the Gentiles, and Mark, probably a different group altogether. And the selection process decided 4 was sufficient. And so we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these 4 present us a full picture of the life and the work of Jesus. We need to refine our view of the Gospels a little further. 3 of those Gospels look very much and sound very much alike. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to share the same materials. They were also written at approximately the same time. John's completely different history. And so people have come up with a term to describe those 3 Gospels, and the term is synoptic. It comes from a Greek word which means something shared, something common. And when you read them, yes, many things are in common. Similar parables, similar sermons of Jesus, similar miracles. However, there are also differences. The birth stories in Matthew and the birth stories in Luke are different. Okay, they're not exactly the same, and Mark doesn't tell any birth stories. All of them speak about certain miracles of Jesus that happen, though the details may be a bit different. And all of them give the same detail with the passion of Jesus, his trial, his crucifixion, his resurrection, all that ending material of the life of Jesus. So there are these parallels, and that's important to remember. The parallels show that they are dealing with the same, and the parallels tell us we're talking about the same story. However, there are also differences, and those differences may be due to the audience selection and the perspective of the author. So Luke writes a more historical account. Matthew writes a very personal account because he was a personal disciple of Jesus. So there are basically 3 views. but the same story. Not much difference in the story, only in detail. And I think it is very important that we respect the differences. Matthew clearly wanted to tell some things about Jesus, and Luke wanted to tell something else about Jesus. So, for instance, Luke focuses on women a lot more. Matthew focuses on the idea of king a lot more. So there are differences. And recognizing and respecting the differences actually helps us to understand those three Gospels better. They are synoptics because they are similar, they share many things in common, but even the synoptics have differences between them. And those differences need to be respected for what they are, authors' choices. Another question to think about is, who were these men who wrote the Gospel? Who was Matthew? Who was Mark? Who was Luke? Who was John? Well, in very brief account, Matthew was a tax collector who was called by Jesus to be a disciple. So he was one of the disciples of Jesus. For over 3 years, he spent his life working with Jesus. But he came from money, he came from a world of corruption. He was hated and despised by the Jews because he worked for the Romans. But then he found a place to belong in Jesus. And he saw the need to portray Jesus as the king, because that's what mattered to him. Mark, well, he was more like a second generation follower. His mother was, her name was Mary, by the way, one of the many Marys in the Gospels, Mary of Jerusalem, apparently a rich woman. He was her son, and he must have followed Jesus as a young boy. He would have been relatively young when Jesus was there. Later, he became a disciple of Paul, but he was not very good, and Paul decided to get rid of him, and then he became disciple of Barnabas, and then disciple of Peter. And his last years were spent with Peter. And it would seem that his memory of Jesus is more like a reflection of Peter's memory. We do not know what profession John Mark may have been. Luke was not Jew, the only non-Jewish writer in the entire Bible. He was Greek, he was a medical doctor, and he wrote with the precision of a medical doctor and a researcher. In fact, he tells us that since he did not have first-hand knowledge of Jesus, he had to research, to do a very modern thing, to find out the details and to put them in proper chronological order. So it's quite important. John was one of the first disciples of Jesus who followed Jesus, very close to Jesus. He's described in his gospel as the disciple that Jesus loved most. Probably a better way is the disciple who loved Jesus the most. His gospel is clearly unique because John seems to be writing to fill the gaps that the synoptics did not have. He wrote his gospel something like 30 years after them. And so he says things, he gives us information and stories and miracles and teachings of Jesus that were not found in those other gospels. So he does not repeat material. In fact, there are only two things that are similar: the passion of Christ and the miracle of feeding the 5,000. The rest of John is different. It was written very late, and so it's unique, and it's important for us to understand that. So we always separate synoptics together, John by himself. Now it's time to look at the Gospels individually. So let's start with Matthew, since he's the first one. We can see that Matthew's intended audience, was clearly Jewish. And the main way to understand this is the fact that Matthew constantly quotes, cites, alludes, echoes the Old Testament. He's the one who's always saying, this happened to fulfill what this prophet said. This happened to fulfill what Scripture said. That would have been important to the Jews to realize that Jesus is a fulfillment of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. And Matthew tells them that that is important. There are some characteristics of the gospel that are important. Matthew likes to record long sermons of Jesus. They seem more like he collated some of the teachings of Jesus into lengthy sermons. There are two outstanding sermons, both quite long. One is known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's found early in the gospel. The other one is known as the end of time sermons or apocalyptic sermon, which comes near the end of the book as well. And so he records sermons. He also records a lot of parables. Nearly half of the parables of Jesus that we know about come from Matthew, particularly parables that are introduced in this way. The kingdom of God is like. So clearly, he is interested in that. The primary concept of Matthew is that Jesus is the king. You see, the great anticipation, the great expectation of Jewish people in the first century is the Messiah. And to them, the Messiah would be this great king like David who would throw away the Romans and deliver them into a new world. And so this is how Matthew, writing to people with that kind of mentality, says, this is the Jesus. This is Jesus, the Messiah you've been waiting for. He is the king. He is the fulfillment of all that. But he's here not to throw away the Romans. He is here to be king of all the nations. And so that is, in brief, the Gospel of Matthew. 28 chapters, and so a relatively long Gospel. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels. Only 16 chapters, and even that, it seemed that some of the parts of the last chapter were added much later. This is the action Gospel. No sermons, no parables. He runs from one miracle of Jesus to the next, one miracle to the next. It's always moving. In fact, when you read the Gospel, and if you read it without pausing between the miracles, you will end up kind of feeling dizzy, like looking at me moving right now. That is Mark, full of action. Jesus did this, and before he finished that, Jesus did this, and before he finished that, Jesus did this. And so this apparently was intended to strike at the heart of the Romans. His audience seems to have been a Roman audience because they were famous for being a people of action. The Romans could not sit still. This is why they created such a huge empire, such a long-lasting empire, an empire that built roads and postal systems and water systems and gigantic cities. This was the Romans, always doing, always acting, and they would respect a God who is a God of action. And so that's how he portrayed. He focuses on miracles. He is a miracle-based gospel. He doesn't care much about the rest of it. Nearly half of the gospel also focuses on those last few days of Jesus' life, what we call the passion narratives. A disproportionate amount of the gospel goes to that as compared to the other gospel writers. His primary concept, however, is an interesting one, that Jesus is human. So in Matthew, Jesus is king. In Mark, Jesus is human. He goes to great lengths to describe Jesus and even uses a special title, Son of Man. Because for the Romans, the humanity of a leader, the humanity of God is what's important. See, the Romans and the Greeks had this strange view that the gods were really just a higher version of humans, and that the good gods were the ones who cared most about human beings and did everything to help human beings. The bad gods were the ones who were always against the humans. And so this would have gone on very well. This would have resonated really nicely with a Roman audience. And that is the Gospel. The Gospel of Luke was written in very polished Greek by a Greek medical doctor. And as a consequence, it reads differently because of that highly sophisticated language. Also a bit difficult to translate. The approach is very historical because Luke tells us he wants to write a historical account of the life of Jesus, step by step, since he was not an eyewitness. So his audience would have been a general Greek audience. It was written in their language. It was written in terms that they would understand. The gospel focuses on the parables of Jesus a lot, but the parables are somewhat different from Matthew's parables. Matthew's parables are about the kingdom. Luke's parables focus more on the kind of God who is. And so his most famous parables, collection of them, is about how God goes in search of things that are misplaced, things that are displaced, things that are lost. That this gives God the greatest joy, is to find things that have been lost. The primary concept of the Gospel of Luke seems to be that Jesus really is the Savior. He is this servant of God who has come to heal, to help. This is the Gospel where Jesus actually cites a mission statement, that he is here to elevate life. So if people are blind, they will see, to reverse life. If they are deaf, they will hear. If they cannot walk, they will walk and jump around. If they are dead, they will come back to life. And so that's important to Luke. Writing to an audience like the Greeks, who are very much into education and learning and art and the beauty things of life, this would have been important. A unique feature of Luke is the focus on women. It is in Luke that we read the names of all those women who were involved, very intimately involved in the work and the ministry of Jesus. And so it's important. And you may wonder why. Well, because Greek culture is very women-oriented in many, many ways. They had famous female gods, women priestesses, and so there was this focus. It was also an attempt to elevate women, since in Roman society, women had a very low position. And so Luke comes across as a very human gospel of a God who is there to serve humanity. Are you that kind of person to provide service, or do you want to be served? Gospel number 4, the Gospel of John, is really, really unique. First, it's unique in dating. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written mid-1st century, around between 65, 66, roughly within a 1 or 2 year period from each other. John was written near the end of the 1st century, some 30 or maybe almost 40 years after the other Gospels. The audience is unique. By the time John wrote this Gospel, the Christian church was in its 2nd generation. And so he's not writing to Gentiles, he's writing to a 2nd generation Christian. And the reason for this is that as the church moved from 1st generation into 2nd generation, new ideas were filtering into the church, new leaders, changes in attitude and lifestyle. And this is why he focuses on the signs. He focuses on the I am statements of Jesus. There are 7 signs and there are 7 such statements. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the way. I am the water of life. And all those I am statements. Ultimately, I am the life, the resurrection and the life. The uniqueness of John is his presentation of Jesus as God. For Matthew, Jesus is king. For Mark, Jesus is human. For Luke, Jesus is a man of service. For John, he is God. So the gospel begins with the most amazing terms, almost like Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, the Word, made everything that exists. Without him, nothing exists. And then it says that the Word became human and lived among us. We don't have this view anywhere in the Synoptic Gospels, but we have in John this uniqueness. His miracles, the so-called signs, are unique. Only one of them is shared with the Synoptics. The others are not. The very first and the very last miracle of Jesus, everything is unique. So John's gospel is kind of unique in many ways. The material is unique, the content is unique, the approach is unique, the view of Jesus is unique, the time scale is unique. And it's important to keep all this in mind, even though in the listing comes right after the others, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But in the timeline, it would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. In the presentation, the 3 synoptics are very similar, and John is way over here. In talking about the miracles of Jesus, only one miracle is shared between this group and John. So it's that kind of an approach. And I guess John wrote, like I said before, as a way of filling in the blanks. What was not said about Jesus before, what was not presented about Jesus by the synoptics is now presented by John. Okay, so now what do we do with these four Gospels? Well, first of all, we need to recognize the similarities. Okay, there are similarities in miracles. Well, at least one miracle that runs through all four of them. All four of them speak about the passion of Christ. All four concentrate on those final few days of Jesus that include his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, his death, and the resurrection. So they're all talking about those things. But there are also differences or variations, and quite a lot of variations. Differences in gospel stories, differences in parables, differences in birth stories. John and Mark, there are no birth stories. Matthew and Luke, there are birth stories. Differences even in the timeline between the beginning and the end of Jesus' ministry. So there are variations. But the common thread is all four Gospels are talking about the same person, Jesus Christ. Whichever way you look at it, whichever way you spin those four Gospels, you see one picture, and that is Jesus. Yes, from John you may see different angles about Jesus, and from Matthew you may see a different angle about Jesus. From Luke you may see something else, and from Mark you may see something else, but they're all talking about Jesus. As somebody once suggested a long time ago, it is like having four mirrors, and each one of them shows a different part of the person. You know, this is called a frontal view. But if I turn to the side, this is called a profile view. If I turn backwards, all you see is the back of my head. And if your camera is positioned on top here, then all you see is my skull. But it's important. All of those determine who this person is. It helps us to see this person more clearly. And so we need the four Gospels. Think of them like the four faces of Jesus. And with the four faces, we get a more complete picture. You know, some people look nice in the frontal view, but when you go into the profile view, they don't look so good. And of course, very few of us would care for our back view unless we have some fancy hairdo. And now that I'm kind of getting a little bald on the head here, a top view reveals the shape of my skull and my head, and and everything else like that. And so all of those views help you to understand me. All of these Gospels help us to understand Jesus. The big question, though, is doesn't matter which Gospel you read, you will still see Jesus. And a bigger question is Jesus a part of your life? Would you like to make him a part of your life? Can you make him? Would you make him a part of your life? If you say yes, then you would study all of them so you will understand him more completely and come to a full understanding of this relationship. And I hope that you will do that.